Welcome back to the Punishment Prairie. I'm in a little bit of a salty mood, which is perfect to play bad cop and talk about the books that I read this year that I really did not like. There were many of them. I have not yet decided on an order. I'm going to pull the list up on my phone and we will take a tour through hell together. We're going to go from best to worst. We're ending with my least favorite. The best of the worst is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. To be charitable as possible to that book, I will say that it is essentially just a middling First Contact or hard SF novel that is overlaid with a bunch of annoying cultural bullshit on top of it that made it very, very difficult for me to enjoy, maybe impossible to enjoy. But at its heart, it's still a sci-fi novel. As I know sci-fi novels, it still has a relationship to foregoing work. It resembles stuff that I think it's superior in terms of its literary value. But in terms of literary value, it is as close to the bottom of the barrel of adult fiction as you can get before you get into YA territory. I'm not trying to be invidious here. I'm not trying to throw all YA under the bus. But it's in this weird uncanny valley that's really uncomfortable where it reads exactly like YA, except it's shot through with a bunch of vulgarity and sex content and stuff. Not saying that that stuff shouldn't be in there. It's just a weird mixture. I have little gripes with it. If the plot is kind of clunky, there's a ton of suspension of disbelief. The exposition is overwhelming and ubiquitous, and also hinges on this plot device that is way too convenient to Andy Weir's, I will go so far as to say, lazy writing style. The thing that is killer to me is the sense of humor in the book. This squee, epic Redditor sense of humor. So this just happened, Anchorman Deadpool. And it is an overpowering factor in Andy Weir's writing. In its guts and its inner mechanics under the hood, it's still an okay science fiction story. I just think there's so much more that's out there that's so much better. Number 4 is Strange Relations by Philip Jose Farmer. God, should that have been number 5? I don't know. We'll just leave it as it is. Number 4, Strange Relations by PJF. My first Farmer. It's a collection of short stories premised around human-alien relationships, and all the chapters are titled after, categories of family member, nuclear family members. They're of varying quality. The first 2 I actually think are good. Mother and Daughter. Those I think are worth reading, and they set my expectations up really high. And then we get into Father, which is a novella that takes up a full third of the book that I thought was completely disrespectfully, lazily written. I know that I said that about Weir as well. I know I sound like a gym teacher blowing the whistle, but you can tell Farmer just had a bunch of notes laying around of things that he wanted to work into a novella, or it was what was on his mind at the time, and he could not be bothered to sit down and work them into some kind of linear framework in terms of the story. And also crowbars in there a bunch of Catholicism fanboyism. Apparently he was not a believer, but he was in love with the Catholic Church. Fair enough, I'm not saying that that is necessarily a bad thing, but he writes these priest characters and these theological themes with this air of he's playing the music of the spheres and he's mixing with the great theosophical themes of the time, of the age, ageless themes. And it's just kind of 2 depressed priests sitting around talking about redemption in a way that's uninteresting, in the exact way that every Priests in Space story is uninteresting, with the one exception of Case of Conscience. JB, the only one to ever do it. Really, really got on my nerves, followed by a very hackneyed story about a man and his submarine. That's a very cliche now Cold War story. It's 2024, Matt. You can't call something from that era cliche. Watch me do it. Watch me do it. And then it wraps on a story that's like a really malicious, really violent retelling of some Ray Bradbury Mars story. Just left a bad taste in my mouth. I don't know. It wasn't for me. It made me not impressed with Farmer. It gave me the impression of him just being really self-indulgent. I also read Feast Unknown by him, which also was bad and annoying in a different way. Farmer, I'm really not sold on. I don't think that he has a bright future on the channel. Then The Third Eye by T. Lobsang Rampa, which is a New Age book from the 50s that was written by a British plumber who was masquerading as a Tibetan Lama, telling his fictitious life story, being initiated into the order of the Lamas and initiated into their great mysteries by way of trepanning, or trepanning, how is it pronounced? That's where you drill a hole in the skull, allegedly to open the pineal gland, the third eye. And this will unlock great powers of spiritual insight and, in fact, magical powers. This plumber guy was found out, his name was Cyril Hoskin, or Hoskins, I can never remember if there's an S on that name. And he soldiered on as Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, saying that he really was the man himself because he fell out of a tree in his yard doing yard work, hit his head, and had a vision of this Lama appearing to him and asking if he could share Cyril's body, which completely checks out. If I was a Tibetan Lama, I wouldn't return to my native Tibet. I would just wander the astral plane until a British plumber got a concussion, and then that would be my big shot at a triumphant return as a best-selling author and earner of great sums. Cyril went on to write, I think, like 20, 30 books. I don't remember the exact number. He's safely out of the picture in terms of cultural influence. The book itself, it's like Tibetan fan fiction written from a guy who checked out one book about Tibetan Buddhism from his local library and then made up a bunch of stuff. It's written sort of like a boy's adventure tale with lots of capers and meeting famous people. I just realized I may be shrouded in darkness. Cyril is punishing us from the heavens by messing up my camera settings. The book itself is only interesting for its backstory and the fact that it was one of the first big best-selling New Age books. Also because it reminds me of other New Age books that I've read. I haven't read a ton of them, just here and there. And that I think a good way to describe them is genre fiction without plot. So it's sort of funny, sort of amusing, but ultimately just a really bad book. The second worst book that I read this year was The Philosopher's Stone by Colin Wilson, which I think is good to talk about in context with the book that I just talked about, because in its heart of hearts, it is a New Age book as well. It is an alleged science fiction novel / cosmic horror novel / critical response to the work of H.P. Lovecraft by this guy Colin Wilson, who was a public intellectual. Wilson was an overnight huge cultural phenomenon upon his publication of his first book, The Outsider, that became this huge bestseller. And his star was rising and rising until he put out more work that led other intellectuals to accuse him of being a pseudo-intellectual poser. Philosopher's Stone is one of his more popular works. He wrote prolifically, both in fiction and outside of fiction. He wrote a lot about the occult, a lot about the New Age topics, but he did write fiction. Philosopher's Stone is a story that has literary lineage in the tradition of H.G. Wells and Olaf Stapledon, and the first, I would say, quarter of it reads like one of those old Wellsian novels of ideas about this young guy who is under the intellectual tutelage of like a country gentleman. And he becomes most acutely interested after this broad-ranging buffet sampling education in the natural sciences and in culture and so on, in ideas around longevity and also the will. And Wilson seems to be gradually building this argument brick by brick towards what looks on the distance to be this big, impressive edifice of this big intellectual breakthrough that's pending. But it's all a mirage. It all leads nowhere. It leads up Colin Wilson's ass. Wilson in his actual private life believed that he would live to be 700 years old, I think was the number, or multiple hundreds of years old, because he was possessed of such an iron will that he would simply by force of focus and effort live forever. Also because he did not personally succumb to the average mental weaknesses of us mere mortals, like experiencing negativity. I find him just personally deeply irritating, both in terms of what comes through in the reading of Philosopher's Stone itself and based on biographical material that I've read about him. I think he was sort of a proto-edgelord and was just incredibly smug. And everything has this feeling of overcompensation. A chair was not pulled out for him at the great table of philosophical discourse. He wasn't invited to the big Socratic meeting of the minds of the time, and I think he was bitter about it, and he compensated for this by having these tossed off kind of hand-waving arguments about countervailing schools of philosophy or cultural movements. A good illustration is there is a part in Philosopher's Stone where he talks about how obviously the collected works of Shakespeare can be discarded. That's stuff for the low proles, that's stuff for the cheap seats, because people of real letters, people of real upstanding literary virtue and insight, know that it just sounds like the squabbling of an elderly gay couple. Wilson does strike me as an insecure person, also because he was happy to enjoy flattering critical acclaim from known fascists, and even when he knew that they were fascists, he didn't seem to be that bothered by the fact, and it kind of tied into this upstart sort of like my first Nietzscheanism power fantasy that he seemed to be on. The book itself also just kind of circles the drain. It loses all of its forward momentum and it devolves into this weird like adventure mystery about South America to do with Lovecraftian gods. By that point, I was just completely uninterested. I didn't even know all of this background info about Wilson. He just got on my nerves to the point where I was checked out. It feels slightly unfair to place it this far down the ranking because I did really like that first quarter of the book. But it's here partially, I think, out of spite because it got my hopes up so high and then it just squandered them. Speaking of being set up and then knocked down again, the worst book that I read this year was also the one that I read most recently. It just made it in under the gun. It's The Last Hurrah of the Golden Horde by Norman Spinrad, a short story collection of work that was published between 1963 and 1969 by the author of The Iron Dream, which is a piece of satire of genre fiction and of fascism that I have praised to the high heavens. In fact, I praised it even in the Patreon review for this as being untouchably good. And the more that I've thought about it and reflected upon how Spinrad irritated me, how incredibly deeply Spinrad irritated me, more so than Wilson. All the bass in my voice for Colin Wilson, Spinrad made me madder. I now wonder how right I was if there was this phenomena afoot in Iron Dream that I just wasn't picking up on because I hadn't sniffed out this tendency or series of tendencies in Spinrad. I will preface by saying about a quarter to a third of the stories are serviceable. There's one story, Outward Bound, that I think is good, but the ones that are bad in ways that may have taken Spinrad just entirely off the table for me. I think Spinrad actually is an interesting bookend to have with Andy Weir, because Spinrad embodied this sense of humor of that generation that I feel like it's not like a perfect analog for the Reddit, like just let people enjoy things, epic style humor, but I think it's sort of as cheap and as prefabricated. It's this very sneering, in your damn face sort of humor that's fueled as much by social criticism as it is by like puns. I don't know exactly how to describe this. If you've read stuff like this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Harlan Ellison does it too. It's sort of like George Carlin at his least funny, and then the spiritual heirs of George Carlin, like the Bill Hicks, like, yeah, I friggin' just went there, dude, sort of humor. Yeah, I own a leather jacket. I own a black leather jacket and a brown leather jacket. And I smoke cigarettes indoors, and you yuppies can't handle it. I hope I'm making sense. I'm hoping I'm describing something that you have experienced in your own reading, because otherwise I'm sure this just sounds unhinged. But it's this allegedly like dangerous, free-thinking perspective that is also laden down with tons of really sort of grotesque caricature and stereotype around race and sex and sexual identity. And I know I can't talk about this without people in the comments saying, "Oh well, it actually sounds good. Thanks, Matt. That sounds based and good. Actually, despite the fact that you think that that's bad, I think that it's good and based as well. And I'm gonna go read that." It's super ugly. It's super embarrassingly dated, like above and beyond whatever subtextual interpretation of like this plays into certain cultural narratives around these interest groups or whatever. It's like using actual racial slurs in a really clumsy way. Yes, of course, this was really common at the time. I know, I read only this stuff. I'm aware of how common this was. This is slightly above. I'm not saying Norman Spinrad is or was a bigot. I'm saying that he was a clumsy writer and the stuff is just not, it does not have a long shelf life. Spinrad annoyed me as well because he has a very 1950s, frankly, sort of McCarthyist politics. At least a third of the stories are moral cautions against the dangers of communism. Are the great dangers of communism state violence, mass death, etc.? Nope, it's that they don't let you wear leather jackets. You can't be the American badass riding down the ramp on your Harley. They want you to stop smoking cigarettes indoors. They want you to buckle your seatbelt. And this is a gray, tasteless cardboard future that this guy refuses to eat. Again, I understand it goes with the time and place. I don't need him to be thumping Mao's book of quotations. It's just trite. Spinrad commits the sin of being banal, belaboring these regurgitated talking points again and again and again. Also writes with this really flashy, showy, stunty, sort of hepcat man on the street tone of voice or humor that's supposed to be, I think, disarming. If that had an effect and it was novel in the 1960s, it isn't anymore. That's not Spinrad's fault. That's time's fault, but still that's another thing that dates it. It has moldered on the shelf. It has rotted in the fridge, and it's not just a neutral property, it's a negative to me. DOA. All right, those are the worst books that I read this year. I appreciate you watching. If you want the 5 best books, I did just put out that video right before this one that's on the channel if you want actual recommendations. Appreciate you watching, hanging out, and I'll see you soon.